Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hey, I hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. I did. It was beautiful, beautiful weather. You know, it's springtime. And we had a couple of those days where the sun was out. Now, on one day, you know, the wind was blowing. It was really a cool, cold wind. But then it died down, and it got up into the mid-70s. And I mean, you know, just absolutely beautiful. So anyway, just want to thank you so very, very much for joining me here on Morning Musings. Now then, we are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 25, 31 and specifically, and following specifically, where we've been focused for a good long while, because virtually all commentators, there are some exceptions, but nonetheless, virtually most commentators say, well, what we have here in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is a prediction of the so-called end of time. We have a prediction here of the end of the endless Christian age. And so it is absolutely critical that we be able to view Matthew chapter 25, 31 in the proper context, to assimilate its testimony along with the testimony of the prophetic source of Matthew 25, 31 and following, along with Jesus' parabolic teaching, which is very clear, as well as the epistolary testimony that echoes and calls on and reflects Matthew 25, 31 and following. And this morning, what I want to share with you is how Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, in his teaching of the resurrection. Now look, let's just face it, there's virtually no one out there that denies that Matthew 25, 31 and following is about the time of the resurrection. I mean, you know, it's the coming of the Son of Man with his angels to sit on the throne of his glory to judge all nations. Well, okay, we are told that has to be the end of time, which of course ignores the fact that this kind of language is typical Hebraic language. Now, I want to read to you, or for you, a quote from N.T. Wright. Now, let me give this caveat, okay? And I want to make sure that I'm understood on this. N.T. Wright is very often inconsistent in much of his applications of prophecies of the coming of the Lord, judgment, especially resurrection. But commenting on the language of Christ coming on the clouds, coming with the angels, coming at the end of the age, etc., etc. He is commenting on Mark chapter 13, 24, Mark 13, 24 through 25, and verse 27 as well. In other words, 24 through 27. Now, these are the passages in the Olivet Discourse that speaks of Christ coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory with the angels. All right? Now, consistency would cause us to say, okay, Mark chapter 13, 24 to 27 is the coming of the Son of Man with his angels to gather the elect. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the coming of the Lord and the gathering of the elect. Therefore, they're talking about the same thing. But this is where the dichotomization in the futurist camps takes place. They agree that Mark chapter 13, 24 to 27, refers to AD 70, but then they jump over to Matthew 25, 31 and following, and they tell us, oh, well, this is end of time. Having said all of that, let me read to you the comments by N.T. Wright on Mark chapter 13, 24 and following. Quote, in this context, the imagery of Mark 13, 24 to 27 can be easily understood. These verses, as Caird urged, are not flat and literal prose. They do not speak of the collapse or the end of space-time universe. They are, as we have seen from passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah quoted above, typical Jewish imagery for events within the present order that are felt and perceived as, quote, cosmic, unquote, or, as we should say, earth-shattering. More particularly, they are regular Jewish imagery for events that bring the story of Israel to its appointed climax. The days of Jerusalem's destruction would be looked upon as days of cosmic catastrophe. The known world would go into convulsions, power struggles, and coup d'etat would be the order of the day. The Pax Romana, the presupposition of civilized life throughout the then Mediterranean world, would collapse into chaos. In the midst of that chaos, Jerusalem would fall. The Son of Man would thereby be vindicated. That would be the sign that the followers of this Son of Man would now spread throughout the world. His angels, that is, his messengers, would summon people from north, south, east, and west to come and to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of Yahweh, unquote. And that is from pages 362 to 363 of his book, Jesus and the Victory of God. And look, he's got that kind of quote throughout there. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make is this. We have world-renowned scholars who recognize that the language of Christ coming on the clouds of heaven with his angels in judgment does not refer to any kind of end of time. It refers to world-shattering events, that is to say, the world of Israel being shattered. Now, mind you that N.T. Wright, in this quote, absolutely expands that to talk about chaos that was in the then known world, in the Roman Empire, and he is absolutely correct. You know, the argument that is given that the fall of Jerusalem was, quote, a strictly local event, unquote, I want to say that is naively ignorant. And I mean no disrespect. I'm simply pointing out anyone that would make that argument, as I have had individuals do in several formal public debates, who have argued, well, look, why would people in Athens or Corinth or Ephesus or wherever, why would they be interested? Why would they even care about the fall of a Jewish city over there in this remote, backwater country of Judea? I'll never forget, in one formal debate that I had with John Welch, a Church of Christ minister that was held in Indianapolis in 2008, John Welch got up and made that very argument. The people in Corinth and Athens, et cetera, they couldn't have cared less about the destruction of Jerusalem. Look how many miles it was, 800 miles or 1,000 miles away. Why would they care? They would not care, John Welch argued. Now, I must say this. During the entirety of that four-night debate, I had double pneumonia. I was sicker than sick. Each night after the debate, I would go to the hotel room, and you'll have to excuse me, and just throw up. I was sick. But I still had enough, acuity about me. I got up and I said, Brother Welch argues that the fall of Jerusalem was such a local event that nobody would have cared. But wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen. Why would anyone in Corinth and Athens, in Ephesus, in Macedonia, why would any of them have cared about the death, about the crucifixion of a Jewish rabble-rouser who was accused of being an anarchist, a fake, a charlatan, and a rebel? And fewer people knew of the death of Jesus than knew about the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem brought about cataclysmic economic impact on traders from all over the Jewish world, all over the Roman world. Far, far more people knew about the fall of Jerusalem than they did about the death of Jesus. Why would they care about the death of this rabble-rousing Jew. And I want to tell you, an electric shock went right straight through that audience. I could see preacher after preacher after preacher. Building was full. Turning to one another and going, wow, wow, wow. Yeah. They knew that Welch had made a fatal blunder. Now, I hope you can see the issue here, ladies and gentlemen. There is absolutely no grounds upon which a person can say Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following has to be a, quote, universal, global in the sense of a modern cosmology, because after all nations would be gathered before him. No, ladies and gentlemen, we must recognize that this language, as N.T. Wright points out, and as G.B. Caird points out, and as other noted scholars have pointed out, this was typical Hebraic apocalyptic language. So when we compare the language, as we have suggested before, when we compare the language of Matthew chapter 24, 29 and following, which, by the way, virtually all amillennialists say that Matthew 24, 29 to 31 through 34 applied to AD 70. Now, there are some who disagree with that, but the majority agree. Virtually all postmillennialists agree. Matthew 24, 29 to 34, AD 70. But then they come to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, and they say, oh, well, this cannot be AD 70 because Matthew chapter 24, a local event, Matthew 25, a universal event. Well, let's hang on to that for a minute. Let's see. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Well, how great was the tribulation supposed to be? Matthew chapter 24, verse 21. For then shall be great tribulations, such as has never been or ever yet shall be. Just how local was that? How insignificant was that going to be, ladies and gentlemen? So when the amillennialists and the postmillennialists tell us that Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 34 was AD 70, but it was a, quote, local event, Lorraine Bettner, in his book on Matthew chapter 24, said one of the problems with dispensationalists and futurists in recognizing the significance of AD 70 is that they fail to understand the tremendous covenantal significance of that event, just like Kenneth Gentry points out, that when it comes to covenantal significance, no other event in history was as cataclysmic as AD 70. So they agree on one hand how significant it was, and then they turn right around and they want to disparage it. But to continue, Matthew chapter 24, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will not give their light, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. That's strictly local? And somebody says, well, you know, the language of the sun being dark and the moon not giving it its blood, that's talking about the destruction of governing authorities. Okay, fine. I agree with that. Don't have a problem with that. But that's strictly local. What we have here is events that if you want to say, well, let's talk about the fall of the Jewish polity, then you can say, okay, but it uses universalistic language. And that's the point. So when we come to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, and someone says, well, look at the language, all the nations. That can't be AD 70 because it was local. Oh, wait a minute. Matthew chapter 24, the sun being darkened, the moon turned to blood, the stars of heaven not giving their light, that's local. Furthermore, Luke chapter 21, 25 and 26, Jesus talked about the distress of all the nations. That's local. Folks, there is no way in this world that we can legitimately, historically, and biblically say that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following posited a, quote, universal judgment as opposed to some, quote, local, unquote, argument about the fall of Jerusalem. And I'm out of time this morning. In the morning, we're going to go to Revelation chapter 11. And we're going to be able to see the direct parallels between Matthew 25, 31 and following and Revelation chapter 11, which will prove definitively that Matthew 25, 31 and following was fulfilled in AD 70. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you on the flip side.